You've watched me build up my empire of steel from nothing. You've seen me cross the star system in search of technology, from the forge world of Vulcanus to the inhospitable oceans of Aquilo. And you've watched as I perfected my craft to produce only the most legendary of items. And now, the chickens have come home to roost. After 2 episodes and more than 5 real-life days of playtime, we're ready to cross the million threshold and build the MegaMegabase. We begin by coming full circle, setting up red science on Vulcanus, just like we did 120 odd hours ago. Unfortunately, a few demolishers mistakenly believed they owned the land I wanted to build on, so I gave them a gentle reminder with my railgun. Although building it on Vulcanus means we'll have to ship quite a few sciences over to Nalvis via space platform, the unlimited iron, copper and stone, and the convenience that brings, make Vulcanus the obvious choice. Red science being red science, it's incredibly simple, and I'm able to direct insert the copper plates and iron gears directly from foundry to machine by using this alternating pattern. I make this little module, which as you can see has a comedically high ratio of rocket silo to science pack assembler. It might seem silly, but the space platform is only overhead for a very small proportion of the time, so the high launching rate allows us to fill the platform quickly so it can continue its journey. After a lot of pondering, I finally conclude that there's not a chance in hell I can route the pipes into this thing, so I have to move the wings out a bit and use double legendary long inserters instead of the bulk ones, after which the pipes fit comfortably. Once I've added a few belts to feed rocket ingredients into the silos, all that's left to do is copy it many times. To reach 1 million eSPM, assuming a research productivity level of 60, which I judge to be reasonable to reach, we need to craft 62,500 packs per minute, which for convenience and to account for any minor mistakes I will probably make, I've rounded that up to 5 fully stacked green belts, which is 72,000 packs a minute. That's going to take a pretty long time to build, considering all the legendary buildings and modules it requires, so I move on to belting over rocket ingredients in the meantime. Given the size and cost of these builds, it's not very often I'm still doing nothing when they finish construction, so the half-finished overviews will have to suffice until the very end. Sure enough, whilst it's still missing a few rocket silos and a lot of modules, I've already moved on to designing green science. This won't be quite as easy, since I can't just craft the ingredients from fluids right on each building's doorstep. There is a balance to be struck with builds like these between size, practicality, and complexity. In an ideal world I would build each science in a single big long stack, but belt throughput limits mean that's not quite practical. For instance, here with green science, I could have maybe just built 2 stacks, but I would have then had to find a way to cram 2 more belts through this space cleanly. So to save my brain this early into the project, I just broke the whole thing into 4 stacks, as you'll soon see. Once I have something I'm happy with, for the most part, I copy that up as many times as its belt throughput will allow for, and then copy that out to the side to reach the required number of stacks for our SPM targets. Unfortunately, that's not us done there, as I still need to make the iron, gears and circuits that will feed the machines. I'll also break this up into stacks, so I can just make the right amount for each stack and then copy that over for each one. I immediately moved on to designing blue science. It would be very easy to get intimidated and flounder at the thought of all the work ahead. But at this point my mindset was to just keep putting one foot in front of the other, just keep doing the next thing, until I'd made enough progress that I'd spent too much time already to give up. I thought a lot about how I could incorporate some direct insertion into blue science like I did with the prior 2, but in the end decided that it would be easier to craft all the ingredients externally and feed them in like the plates, gears and circuits from green science. Despite the frankly ridiculous amount of beacons I used for the science assemblers, the long crafting time of blue science makes this build quite girthy? I start off with engine units, which are quite easy considering they can be made entirely out of molten iron, a property the other ingredients don't share. Red circuits are up next, and whilst I would have loved to share the 4 beacons in the middle there to save some resources, my green belts don't quite bridge the gap. Ignore the fact I could have easily just left a gap between the EM plant and the beacons to put the undergrounds there. I've only just realised that right now. The final ingredient is of course sulphur, which I bundle up next to the plastic for the circuits. We're going to need oil to make the plastic and circuits, as well as for the other sciences down the line, so I get a big coal liquefaction plant set up. I hate trying to ratio with oil products, so I had no idea if this was a sufficient amount, and still don't because I'm writing this script right now to procrastinate working on cryogenic science, so I've not stress tested all the factories yet. A fact that hindsight has gifted me, however, is that putting all those speed modules in the cryo plants was pretty much useless, as it's heavily bottlenecked on the 6,000 units a second limit on each fluid output. My prior conceptions about Fluids 2.0 make it very weird to me that the number of fluid outputs connected from a machine actually increases its throughput, even if it absolutely makes sense. Once I've belted in some coal and primed the system using the shitty heavy oil recipe, the build spins to life. Of course, it pretty much immediately stopped since we're not actually balancing or using any of the oil products yet, so I set up oil cracking too. It might not look that big, but between the legendary chemical plants, beacons and speed modules, it's got easily more than 10 times the throughput of an equivalently sized common build. Upon connecting the petroleum, coal and water to the blue science ingredient stack, it springs to life, and we can see if it works. Yep, it's certainly producing things. I've got no idea if my calculations were right and that's enough production, because we're about 4 hours of module production away from it being finished, so I guess I'll just move on and find out later. Time to copy this untested production module 4 times. I'm an engineer. Something interesting pointed out to me by a commenter is that putting speed modules in quality production isn't the stupidest idea ever. Even though legendary speed modules confer more of a speed bonus, they don't actually give any extra quality debuff over their common counterparts, so you can actually get an appreciable amount more quality production per minute for the cost of a slightly higher material cost. Next up, I've redistributed the cargo bays on Nalvis, so that I can start figuring out how I'm going to get 55 belts of science out of this landing pad. The answer is dragging and screaming. I'll tell you one thing, it's not happening via inserter, so I get to work smothering the pad with roboports. Theoretically, robot throughput is soft capped at some ridiculous number, but in practice it's limited by how much of your base you're willing to turn into roboports. I'll feed all the sciences into these requester chests, which then dump immediately onto belts, half a belt of science each. I'll then only need 10 of these to pull out all the science I'm going to need, but getting it onto the belt is easy, getting it off is the hard part. I even took the time to turn it into a rainbow for your viewing pleasure. I took a moment to wonder how you get 6 belts of input into this, and then I realised you don't, and accepted I'll have to take a hit on the total beacon number and up my legendary lab production at some point. Yes, that's 7 belts of input. I said I was good at Factorio, I never said I could count. I realised my mistake as I'm connecting the Rainbow Road up to the stack. So, how many legendary labs surrounded by legendary beacons full of legendary speed modules will I need for half a belt of science? 6? A dozen? 30? All I knew at this point was that I'd used up every single legendary lab I'd ever crafted and still not exhausted a single of the 10 half belts I'd need to consume by the end of this. Time to kick that can down the road. I would probably say that the beginning of designing purple science was the moment where the brain damage imparted by this run really began. Building science setups is fun. Doing a bit of logistical routing is fun. Building big, complicated modules you're trying to keep small for aesthetic reasons, but not too small for exhibitionary reasons, which don't finish constructing for hours, so you can't really test on the fly and might end up needing to be entirely reconstructed later if you made a mistake because of a previously mentioned compactness, is not fun. It hurts. But it'll be worth it when I can sit back and look at that 7-digit eSPM number. I pulled direct insertion back out for rails for crafting purple science, but I honestly don't even know why, as it uses more belts to send rails down completed than to send their ingredients down and craft on site, as a full belt of stone, steel and iron sticks turns into 2 belts of rails. Because of the pure throughput of rail ingredients required, I'm going to have to split this one into a whopping 16 stacks. Each of these 8 stacks here actually being 2 stacks facing into each other. It almost certainly would have been easier to feed rails in crafted and find a way to get a 4th belt in to make 8 big stacks, but I've made my choice now. Next up, I started on the external production module for rails, which is quite convenient because we get stone as a byproduct from making molten iron for the steel and iron sticks. An intelligent approach for this would be calculating whether we make excess stone or excess molten iron, so I can figure out if I need to be pumping extra iron in or excess iron out. But my idea was to just build the thing, let it run, and then figure that out the hard way. I hedged my bets early that I was going to need to pull iron out of the system, but the pumps can be easily reversed if I'm wrong. I move on to the electric furnace and productivity module production in the meantime, and I'm again using the stone from producing molten copper to make bricks for electric furnaces. I'm so sure that I'll have too much molten copper that I not only add an outflow like for the iron, but also a dedicated copper voider for if that isn't enough. I cram the red and green circuits in next, and since I'm making red circuits that needs plastic. Here's what I end up with for the production module. A big mess. It's only then that I realised that I didn't leave a space to run the rocket ingredients to the silos. And after I started figuring that out, I realised I also hadn't routed the productivity modules and electric furnaces into the science assemblers. Buffoon. The absolute mess I've caused here by not leaving enough space is incomprehensible. They used to hit people with hammers for making monsters like this. Anyway, with no further questions asked, time to copy it a load of times. Unlike the other 2 science builds, it needs copying to the top 2, since as I mentioned earlier, each stack is actually 2 stacks facing into each other. Once I've copied them all down, you can see that this is going to be quite an immense build. Talking about immense, here's an update in the lab setup department. That might just about be enough for 1/10 of our total requirements. I'm going to need to actually move some of this science at some point, so welcome Mango Loco into the world. Yep, we're naming them after monster flavours this time. Although this galaxy shape might be pretty cool, the thought of trying to fit all of the engines and make it work is making my brain melt. So instead, it's getting shaped like a monster can. After sneaking a little nuclear reactor in under the hub, I can put down some grabby arms so we can produce fuel. You're probably wondering how I'm planning to get ammo to the front of the ship through all those cargo bays. I don't. It's gonna look like a rave up here. Once I've set up the asteroid crushing and fuel production, I can get her loaded up with red science. I'm requesting 360,000 red science packs, which is 5 minutes worth of production, so as long as it can complete a round trip in less than 5 minutes, then it'll be able to cope with demand. That does however mean we're going to have 1 Mango Loco for every single science pack, except for Cryogenic, which will need a ship that can handle the outer system, and Space Science, which will make alternative arrangements for. Anyway, it took me precisely 0.95 trips to figure out that this number of laser turrets won't be sufficient. However, that's as many as our nuclear power plant can support. What to do? The correct answer was probably to scrap the lasers, make some ammo production, and have it done with. My answer? Legendary nuclear reactors. 2.5 times more power means 2.5 times more laser turrets. It now has little issue with asteroids, so I copied down 3 more of the same platform for green, blue and purple science. With red, green, blue and purple science complete, we could now theoretically research mining or steel productivity at 1 million eSPM. However, as I mentioned before, we only have 1/10 the number of labs we would need to consume that amount of science. Let's make that 1/5. When I built Purple Science earlier, and I was pondering whether it takes more iron in or spits more out, it turns out that it landed firmly on the side of out. So much so, in fact, that I had to set up this big iron voiding setup, because the other sciences weren't using up the iron enough, and we were beginning to run low on stone for the rails. There is no rest for the wicked, so immediately I get to work on military science. Yes, we are actually automating that. When building it, I didn't put beacons between the pairs of assemblers like I have with every other science. This causes an issue which I want you to try to figure out before it manifests, because it comes back around later too. Whilst you think about that, it's time to turn that fifth of the necessary labs into 2/5. Eventually, anyway, it might take a while to build. I've also started using common biolabs and only upgrading them to legendary as they craft, so that we can still do some research, even if it's a bit slow. I then realised that my power fucking died. Ruh-roh. Turns out that when I demolished that little iron production I set up when I first landed here, I hadn't considered what it was providing for. Namely, fission cells for the reactors. I set up a provider chest pulling from a random iron plate foundry so that this won't happen again, and then tried to kick the reactors back to life with some handcrafted cells. Back at military science, I'm starting off with walls because it needs a truly silly amount of stone. For legendaries, this is a lot of buildings, but we actually need to double it. On today's game of Spot the Problem, here's my stone production from molten copper. Red ammo and grenades come together quite easily, despite some belt shenanigans to get iron and coal into the grenade assemblers. Funnily enough, the inability to productivity module any direct ingredient actually makes military one of the more annoying sciences to build. In regards to the molten copper, if you spotted that I hadn't made any way to actually get the molten copper out of the machine, you're smarter than me. I end up with this, which, although slightly less elegant, wasn't too much of a change from what I had originally. Rather than deal with the molten copper internally, like would have been the intelligent choice, I ended up just making an expandable external void, which they could all connect up to. There's nothing wrong with it, in theory, but it could have easily fit into each stack individually. After setting up a little molten iron setup to feed it, I then need, and this is a technical term, a metric fuckton of coal. Since I finished the builds for the first 4 sciences, my mining productivity research has absolutely took off, and so I'm able to fill a fully stacked green belt with no more than 4 big mining drills. Keep in mind that quality has no effect on mining speed. Your eyes do not deceive you, that's 16 stacked green belts of coal, the equivalent of 86 unstacked blue belts if your brain still runs on pre-space age metrics like mine does. For now, I connect the first 3 up to the stack we've built to make sure it works before I build the rest. A quick glance at the minimap will reveal how dire the module situation is. Every flashing yellow symbol is a machine missing at least one module. I think I've given you enough time to figure it out. It was probably pretty obvious. But the problem with the military science production is that I never left any room to insert rocket ingredients into the silos. I toy around with using requester chests to insert the ingredients, but in the end just deconstruct the whole thing and reconstruct it with gaps in between the stacks to run belts. That'll give the construction bots something to chew on. The great but slightly annoying thing about rocket silos is that if they've got productivity modules and are affected by any more than like 1 legendary speed beacon, you know they're launching as fast as they possibly can due to the animation cap. I sometimes find myself wishing higher quality silos could launch rockets faster, which might have assuaged some of my later mistakes. I'm happy enough that the module is working so I can copy it and hook up the rest of the coal belts. You might think that all this coal mining would dry out that patch pretty quickly, but between the 16% resource depletion from legendary big drills and my hundreds of levels of mining productivity, the patch will last hundreds of times longer than usual. I was hoping that would be military science done, sans modules, but my external copper sink has come back around to bite me, and I had to double its size for the 4th or 5th time. Making a surprise return after last being seen in my Nullius series, I downloaded the Auto Research mod so that I could queue mining productivity automatically instead of needing to fill the queue with it every 15 minutes. The decision to make mining productivity costs scale linearly makes sense, but it's also funny how ridiculously high we can get the number due to that. I've gathered up enough inertia from finishing military science now and can go straight into yellow science. Conventionally, yellow science is considered the hardest pre-space science, but as you'll see, it's going to practically fall together. LDS is pretty simple, just taking 3 fluids and some coal to make the plastic, and I've made blue circuits a million times at this point, so that was never going to be an issue. It does take a lot of copper though. Good job military science produces so much that it's an actual problem. Fun fact from a bit later on, if yellow science isn't running, military still doesn't get rid of enough copper to hit full pelt, although that's not really an issue, because there isn't any infinite researchers that take military science but not yellow. My commitment to keeping the whole build in the same footprint as the science assemblers and rocket silos has led to me using blue belts for what I believe to be the first time in this entire run to commit the sin of belt weaving for the flying robot frame assemblers. It looks pretty slick. I might do it more. Steel is easy with all the molten iron pipes running around. I can nick some green circuits off the blue circuit build, and batteries are pretty easy considering they just require combining 3 fluids. I then realised I need to pull green circuits over for electric engines from somewhere, and wanting to make sure it gets a balanced amount from both belts suddenly turned this into a bit more of an issue. The electric engine production itself is pretty small, but pulling lube all the way from my oil setup to here was quite the odyssey. I realised now that until we're firing on all cylinders, military science won't necessarily be getting produced at the same time as yellow science, leading to vital copper being voided and the yellow science build being starved until military science starts up again. So my solution is a truly ridiculously sized molten copper buffer. It's like one of those things new Factorio players build for light and heavy oil before they discover cracking exists. Anyway, I'm happy enough that it seems semi-functional at this point and can copy it out and set up its Mango Loco. Somehow, it's already time for our final science pack that will be produced on Vulcanus, the Metallurgic Science Pack. He will never forget to add rocket component. Buffoon! The first 2 ingredients, tungsten carbide and tungsten plate, are pretty easy, just made by combining tungsten ore with carbon or molten iron, respectively. The real problem is making enough molten copper, and unfortunately all of military science probably produces about enough to feed a quarter of what we need, so I'll have to figure something else out on site. I got distracted mid-build, however, and noticed that Spectre is just gone. I couldn't find it in any of my autosaves, so it must have happened hours ago, and I just never noticed.
Oh no! Anyway...
To get rid of the stone byproduct from molten copper, I'm just turning it into furnaces and recycling over and over like I did for voiding byproducts of EM science. You might be thinking metallurgic science has been too easy so far, and that's because it has. The real problem is somehow getting 14 belts of tungsten ore over here. My first idea was trains, but at this scale they're very impractical, so I instead go for the old reliable strategy of running a massive fully stacked belt for miles through the boonies. But my expandability, my heckin' wholesome modularity, what happens when the patch runs out? What happens when the patch runs out? I don't intend to still be here when the patches run out. There's belt 1 and 2 of 14, so we can at least make sure it works. Science is definitely crafting, but I feel like something's missing here. If tungsten had the same mining speed as everything else, I probably could have done all 15 belts off 1 or 2 particularly large patches. But alas, here I am connecting tungsten patches from here and there and everywhere to feed the machine. And when I connect up the last one, I feel nothing. By making green belts and belt stacking and neglecting my precious little trains, the devs have corrupted me. I don't feel like I've won anything here. I've gone against everything I swore to when I first delayed Track and Sleeper. This doesn't feel like a victory, it feels like betraying an old friend. Alas, up on Casino Royale, It's about time we expand space science production. This is the setup I have for the actual science, with each craft giving us 5 science packs, 10 after productivity. You actually need very little input materials to make a lot of science. So as you can see, it's split into 5 chunks, so I can pull out the 5 belts in increments. For the inputs, I just have 3 pairs of legendary asteroid collectors hooked up to 3 copies of the chunk sorting I used from my previous space science setup. In terms of processing, this is all we need. I'm not kidding. After that, I do some fuel production and an array of extra thrusters to try to offset the drag and extra weight this has added onto the platform. Down on Nalvis, my legendary lab production has been severely hamstringed by a lack of legendary eggs, so I quadrupled the production, because I can. Having a base this well established is the closest thing I'm ever going to get to the feeling of being truly Musk Bezos Gates level fuck off wealthy. Now that 8 out of 11 sciences are done, which sounds really good in theory, I have no other choice but to take on the big 3, starting with cryoscience. If you think the brain damage got bad with purple science, just you wait. I wrote most of this script procrastinating cryoscience alone. I started off by trying to design a stack from scratch, before realising my previous cryoscience setup was pretty good and just copying some of that. 7200 SPM, which is about 1/10 of what we'll ultimately need, takes about 14 cryo plants, so that's a pretty good number for each stack. Next up we'll need to cool the plants, so I set up twin cooling plants at the end. The cooling process is lossy, so I set up a plant to produce the coolant itself, as well as a machine to turn the ocean water into both ice for the science and ammonia for the coolant and some other purposes. This is easy. And then I go to Nalvis to copy down another lab setup. Why? I don't know, we were doing cryoscience. Coolant requires solid fuel and raw lithium as ingredients, so I've put them next to each other, and the plan is to insert them both into this chest, with circuit controls of course to stop one filling it up all the way, and then insert from that into the coolant plant because it really doesn't need that much of either. I then think for a while. Heat pipe make me brain melty. The final direct ingredient of cryoscience is smelted lithium, so I can set up a few furnaces for that down here next. I get that connected up with the ice to a belt running down to the science assemblers, and I must be basically done now, right? Well, my stupid ass got distracted again looking at metallurgic science, because I wondered why it was bottlenecking my artillery range research. Yeah, and I never got around to extincting the biters. Sue me. But anyway, I look at the silos, and as we already know, no fucking rocket ingredients. I'm not cut pasting it all out like I did with military science, so the quester chests will have to suffice. Anyway, it's move making time back on Aquilo, as I connect this science stack up to the rocket fuel belt so it can heat itself. I forgot to add inline robo parts, so I'm placing them on either side for each stack, which has the double effect of giving me a little bit of leeway with the footprint I decided on for the build, which I will use. You probably noticed that unlike every other science build so far, besides space, but that doesn't count, I'm not directly inserting science into the rocket silos. This was a calamitous lapse in judgment. Let's do some maths. Assuming there's always another rocket ready in the silo when the prior one launches, then a rocket silo can launch a rocket about once every 27 seconds. Let's call it 30 for simplicity. Each rocket holds 1,000 science packs, and if a rocket launches every 30 seconds, then that means we can launch 2,000 packs per minute per silo. Considering this is a 7,200 packs per minute stack, and that is 2 rocket silos, aka 4,000 packs per minute, we're gonna have to do some redesigning. Time to spend 45 minutes staring at fucking nothing to ponder this. On the bright side, we can watch the science stack warm up, which is kind of satisfying. My idea was to just use inserters and pass through from the 2 rocket silos to 2 more rocket silos. I still can't make any snarky comments on the eventual effectiveness of this because I'm still procrastinating finishing this build as I write this. Professional YouTuber here. The only thing that's seemingly missing now is a way to void all of the excess ammonia, for which you should not be surprised I'm employing the cheesy fluid deletion mechanic I've used basically everywhere else. Before I even finished it, and it's by no means a complicated system, my excitement got the better of me because finally, after nearly 50 hours into building this MegaMegabase, I have a use case for trains. The fluid requirements for this build are surprisingly small, coming out to something like a train every 15 minutes for lithium brine, and even less for fluorine. Crude oil I won't even train in. I can use the same supply I've always been using from the main island. I already had the knack for building Aquilo train stations locked down when I first came here, so setting that bit up was probably the easiest part of this whole build. You can see at the bottom there, I realised I didn't really have a good place to put the ammonia ocean pumps, so I'm making use of that footprint leeway I gave myself to put them slightly outside of the build. I'll just have to make sure I don't put something on the top in the same place. Because of the low fluid throughput requirements, my plan is to just have one train for each fluid take care of each stack, so this train stacker was kind of pointless. I then realised that this lithium cryo plant was meant to have beacons, so it's a good job I left some space on the top and bottom. It does however interfere with the offshore pumps, believe it or not, so I'll have to move them a bit, won't I? After setting up a lithium brine outpost up here, I actually measured how big the science stack would be and realised it was in the way, so time to tear it down again and move it up here. With that lithium brine trained in, the lithium cryo plant correctly beaconed, and the ammonia sink finished, all that's left now is fluorine, and crude oil, but that's still coming from the starter patch. Once that's connected up, it all starts up at once, and we have 9 sciences out of 11 producing, but not quite done. We need 9 more of these stacks first. Speaking of which, let's get that second one copied down. The tiny fluorine outpost wasn't going to do much, so I spread it out to cover the whole patch. Funnily enough, at over 700 levels of mining productivity, this is probably enough for the full build. Anyway, after setting up a new rocket fuel build since the old one was struggling, and after struggling to make a larger fusion reactor set up on this planet, so instead copying down a load of little ones, I'll skip over the hours of waiting for the slow-ass Aquilo construction bots to build all the science to the bit when it's done, besides for a few rocket silos anyway. We can now say that 9 out of 11 sciences are complete. The mere thought of even looking at Fulgora is making me queasy after the last time we were there, so my next planet is everyone's favourite, Gleba. I'm not joking, because it is my favourite, and if it's not yours, you're a coward. I found a good area far out west with a good amount of nearby green and purple biome, and get down to designing this thing, starting with the science pack production itself. As you can see, I'm planning for a very strict footprint here, because I want it to look cool. Anything to stay sane at this point. Pentapod eggs are next, and they take so much nutrients I decided to direct insert it and belt in bioflux. These things have a way of starting off simple and very quickly snowballing into a massive mess, as I need to figure out how I'm going to get nutrients in and spoilage out of literally everything. The design I end out with isn't quite as nice as the one I had in my head, but we move on. Believe it or not, this one biochamber is enough to produce the nutrients to fuel the entire stack, even with every biochamber having prod-free modules and being affected by at least 3 speed-free beacons. And that's with me counting the pentapod egg assemblers, the fuel part obviously. But they don't need these nutrients because they already get fed by the biochambers that make their ingredient nutrients. Next up is bioflux, which also needs shockingly few machines. You've caught me here mid-conniption about how I'm going to route all of the nutrients into it and spoilage out. In the end I had to start the shared nutrient and spoilage belt backwards, with spoilage on the outside and nutrients on the inside, and then flip it back later with a filtered splitter to make this fit in the tiny space. Here's the fruit processing and aforementioned splitter. We need just north of a belt of Umicore, and a bit more than half a belt of jelly nut to get the 86,400 packs per minute of agri-science we want here, so that's why there's 3 belts running through the middle. You did hear me right, 86,400 packs per minute, as since agri-science rots and that reduces its research capabilities, we need to leave a bit more headroom to make sure it can keep up. Before we get to the rocket silos, I add these recyclers to destroy any pentapod eggs or bioflux that reach the end of the belt so they don't back up and spoil. The footprint of the build itself is just exactly big enough to fit a silo, so the science and rocket ingredients must be underground belted through them. I'm also bringing in rocket ingredients by requester chest, because I have more than 25,000 logistics bots on this planet, and more rocket part productivity than I know what to do with. This is, I think self-evidently, massive overkill in the silo department. I don't know why I did it. To supply my Yumiko needs, I need 280 farming space per one of these stacks, which is the equivalent of like 6 agricultural towers with all available spaces arable. That means for the full build we need 36 agricultural towers farming Yumiko. More, since there will be some areas of non-green biome in some of those towers. I'm getting seeds to the towers by way of, again, logistics bots because, again, I have 27,000 of them. At any given point we either have too much Yumiko or too little, and since spoilage makes buffering not an option, I put these heating towers at the very end of the belt to destroy any excess. The process for Jelly Nut is literally the same, except it graciously requires like half as many agricultural towers. I'm not building all the stacks now because we'll still be waiting a while on overgrowth soil, but this boosted production will actually make our overgrowth soil production faster, as it's limited by the number of seeds we have. Soon enough we have a little trickle of both fruits and can put some nutrients into the machines to get the loop going. After looking at it for about 0.7 seconds I quickly realised I forgot to beacon the Yumiko processing, but that's quite easily fixed. It boots up slowly and then all at once. With a few kidnapped eggs from the old science build we can see it raw to life faultlessly, a kind of lull before the storm that is Fulgora. Unlike previous planets, I'm not finishing it right now. Like I said, the overgrowth soil won't be ready for a few hours, so I'll be remotely copying a new stack every now and again until it reaches full capacity. It will get its time in the limelight later in the video, however, as it's easily one of my favourite things I build in this entire project. After that relatively pleasant experience, it's time to descend into hell. I'm not kidding, megabasing Fulgora makes every other planet look like a stroll through the daisies. This place is trash and it wants to remain that way. This will not prevent me from trying. The first thing I do is find a scrap island, which of course will be the very core of the base. My first idea is to mine directly into a rocket silo and feed that into recyclers, since my mining productivity level is so high, each drill produces more than even a well-beaconed legendary recycler can process. I beacon the absolute shart out of it before realising you can't insert blue circuits and LDS into rocket silos, as they will only ever be treated as rocket components and won't go into storage. So I'm keeping the rocket silo idea, but I'm including belts which can pull blue circuits and LDS out without needing them to pass through the rocket silo. Batteries are almost always the limiting factor on purely EM science builds, so my next step is to work through all the scrap products and find ways to destroy overflow of everything else. Concrete gets turned into hazard concrete and then gets recycled back into concrete on a loop, same with steel into steel chests. Ice and solid fuel can just get recycled in a little loop, and gears get recycled into iron and then crafted back into gears. The shapes and sizes of all these little bits will change a lot over the course of this build, so I encourage you to look at the overall structure rather than the finer details. I do start some actual production here, turning ice into water and combining that with stone and holmium ore to make holmium solution and then plates. The plastic from recycling red circuits is needed for making superconductor, and the copper can be used to make batteries to help make up the shortfall. I encourage you to enjoy the petrochemical knot I tied myself into trying to make batteries in this thing. I certainly didn't. Electrolyte comes next along with some rocket fuel since the solid fuel was already coming this way with the ice belt. Then it's supercapacitors and accumulators, the two solid ingredients of EM science. Combining those two together along with electrolyte and holmium solution gets us our precious EM science. The target for each of these setups is 7200 packs per minute, and with 2 fitting on each patch we'll have to cover only 5 patches to get 72,000 packs per minute. Probably the hardest thing to scrap are LDS and blue circuits, and I tried just doing a dumb block like this, but it very quickly backed up. A slightly more intelligent interpretation for blue circuits might look like this, which properly separates out the products so they cannot back up. It's also stealing the plastic out to feed the main build, since we have a chronic shortage for superconductor. LDS is a bit easier after that, especially since we want the copper and plastic for batteries and the previously mentioned superconductor respectively. I get around to cleaning up some of the rough edges left, such as a green circuit voider for if they back up, since we produce ever so slightly too many from scrapping red circuits. I copy and flip it to give us what will eventually be a 14,400 packs per minute module, once we've ironed out the rest of the kinks. It's easily the biggest and ugliest of the science builds we've made. I have to have a bit of a shuffle around to get some more beacons in and meet production demands, but after that, all we're waiting for is a few more scrap productivity researches to finish for it to hit its peak. I get a second one copied down, but just like Glaber, it's going to be a waiting game. This time for some more foundation to be delivered. We have most of it just from it accumulating over the last few dozen hours, but it's being delivered by Citroen DS3, so it's not coming fast and there's still a bit more we'll be waiting on to produce. It's with no regret whatsoever that I inform you I do not intend to take Prometheum science to 1 million eSPM. That's a task not well suited for even the best computer, and after taking a month-long sabbatical from the run due to burnout, I'm not putting myself out for another month just to watch a PowerPoint of a space platform. I'm still going to do something interesting though, don't worry. I intend to speedrun to the Shattered Planet. The first bit to plan is of course the weaponry. We're going to need a lot of it, but maybe not as much as you think. Once the front row is filled with railgun turrets, adding any more width to the build just exposes you to more asteroids, so the ship needs to just be wide enough to fit this massive fusion reactor on it. Again, maybe not as big as you think it should be, because legendary quality means our power demand won't be as astronomical as our ammo production. Next up is probably far too many asteroid collectors, but you can never be too careful. I won't inundate you with the details of its design. God knows I've made enough space platforms this run, but here's a quick overview. A detail which is worth noting is that I'm not just double layering, but triple layering the thrusters. To get to the Shattered Planet in less than 2 hours, which is my goal, I need to average at least 555 km per second, but my hope is that if I can go way faster early on, I can afford to slow down later when the asteroid barrage is at its worst. Whilst I slowly grow my farming operation on Glaber, it's time for me to send out the platform, which I've named Ultra after my wife's favourite flavour of monster. Here we can see it in action, cruising at 750 km per second, way past the star system's edge. You might notice the backwards facing railguns on the sides there, and like me you might have never even seen the front of a railgun until now, but those are there to snipe any huge asteroids that come a bit too close and might hit one of my trailing thruster stacks. I don't have to worry about them hitting the ship itself however, because that would require an asteroid to be inside it, and if that were the case, then that's already game over. I think I realised at this point it's probably going to need some spare parts, because I increased the production buffer of railgun turrets on Aquilo a decent amount. It probably would have been best to use higher quality and particularly legendary railgun turrets for the extra range, but I never set up legendary quantum circuit production, and I certainly don't plan to do it now. It actually seems to be going alright until I leave it running for a bit and come back to this. This is pure speculation because I wasn't actively watching, but I'm 90% sure this has something to do with the backwards facing railguns. I turn it around to head back to Vulcanus for some servicing, resupplying and a redesign. In my infinite wisdom, I decided the answer was just more backwards facing railgun turrets, but thankfully I quickly realised that's a fucking stupid idea and removed them. By the time it reaches 1.5 million kilometres of the way out to the Shattered Planet, it's still holding up pretty strong. It gets the occasional inconsequential hit on a railgun, but even if one is destroyed there's 40 spares in the cargo, enough to lose one every 100,000 kilometres, as well as 10,000 repair packs. After a glancing below from an asteroid, I disconnected some fuel plants to slow the ship down slightly, but still above the average required speed of 555 km per second. At this point we're 36 minutes in. By 2.5 million kilometers, I've slowed down to 489 kilometers per second, below the average speed we need, but since we were going 200 kilometers per second over that at the start of the journey, I'm not too worried yet. What I am worried for is YouTube's compression algorithm. For that, this is some sort of cruel and esoteric form of torture. It's also cruel and torturous for my poor CPU, so to increase UPS I spend most of the time not actually looking at the platform, instead just zoomed in on the floor and Glebber. But what's this? Something's getting shredded. Somewhere. Oh shit. We can only hope it made it first. When I did get back and load an autosave, the results are still inconclusive. But yes, pretty soon it's clear it's going to make it. It probably got destroyed because I never programmed it to come back, and it will have sat here getting assaulted on all sides by huge asteroids. So how long did it take? I wasn't actually looking at it the moment it crossed the solar system edge, but going off the distance and speed before we first slowed it down, we can work backwards and see it took off at approximately the 205 hours and 25 minute mark. And given that we're now at 207 hours and 17 minutes, that gives us a time of 1 hour and 52 minutes. Not bad at all. Over on Fulgora my 5 science setups have finished, but I was terrified to find them all backed up on batteries. I tried this little circuit thing to only add the crafted ones when we're low on the ones from scrap, but neglected to realise the only reason it was backed up was because the science packs are backed up. Idiot. The science conglomerate on Vulcanus needed a bit more molten iron, so I sorted that out, and then I discovered that green science only just has enough silos to keep up with the 72,000 packs a minute, so it needs a second space platform to move it all. Here we can see though that we can hold LDS productivity research solid, so that's red, green, blue, purple and metallurgic science pack ticked off. Same with blue circuit productivity, so that's EM science ticked off. Rocket damage would tick off everything but cryo science, but we're still not quite farming enough to keep that consistent, so we check cryo science for now, and that looks good. And after some manually messing with the quest amounts of the 2 agri-science platforms, and adding a few more agricultural towers, we get that to average around 1 million eSPM, although it never quite stays flat thanks to the randomness spoilage introduces. As I give you a brief overview of the base, I'd like to give my thoughts on this series, which has taken a decent portion of the last 4 months of free time in my life. For a start, I'm not a megabaser. I'll never be a megabaser. This was torture. Give me my overhaul mods back. I think that was reflected well in the upload schedule for this series, but despite this being one of my least enjoyable videos to make, I'm proud of what I came out with, and I think the result looks pretty good. Funnily enough, my opinions from my original Space Age series haven't really changed too much. Glebber is still my favourite. I still think Vulcanus is far too easy, there's a reason I put all my science there, but this time I'd probably put Fulgora below Aquilo. I got a decent amount of enjoyment from designing that Aquilo build, but my every waking moment on Fulgora was torture. Honestly, I wouldn't recommend megabasing in Space Age purely for the fact you'll have to scale Fulgora at some point. I do hate to keep it brief, but I'm looking forward to moving on to some more hopefully interesting projects. So as always, I'd like to thank my Ko-Fi supporters for supporting me in what I do. Their names are on screen now, and in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.